Okay, well, it is time to get going. Um, we are continuing on with the topic we had last week, talking about non-institutionalism, which is, I understand, a bit of a niche topic. It's probably not your typical Sunday morning sermon type material, but it is something that's important because it is, I think, something that has affected the church, and it's something that it's affected Dayton. We talked about that a little bit last week. So last week, what we did was we went through and talked about non-institutionalism a little bit from their perspective and some of the things that they would say about what makes us distinct from them. And this week we're going to offer some rebuttal to that and more of what I would agree with. I don't have them here with me right now, but right after, I've got handouts that are in my office. Forgot to grab them for last week's and this week's if you want to look at them, because it's a lot of material, and hopefully that will help you a little bit. But we talked a little bit last week. This discussion has had a lot of, not bad players, but a lot of people have been very hostile on both sides. And there's a lot of history. And people have not always acted well towards each other. And so we want to be cautious to not do that. And I think God would want us, and I think God does want us to be unified. And I think this is an issue that if we ever want to regain some unity, you got to have some good faith on both sides. And so don't want to be calling people names and some of those things that's happened in the past. But okay, so let's pick up. There were three major differences between non-institutional churches and I guess we could say institutional churches. What were those three things that we talked about last week? The first one was evangelism. What was the big difference on evangelism? How the non-institutionals do evangelism versus we sometimes do evangelism?
They don't want to use the church treasury for non-members.
Yeah, that's going to fall under benevolence. But yeah, a lot of this has to deal with how funds are used. So as far as evangelism goes, there was a concern about one church giving funds to another church for that church to disburse to evangelists and various things like that. And so they had some reasons, and all of these things have reasons behind it, and we looked at some of those reasons last week, and we'll talk about it a little bit more this week, I guess. But that's the crux of the issue here. Does a church have the right? Is it sinful? They'll say it's sinful for a church to give funds to another church, for that church to then disperse those funds to another evangelist or whoever it might be. Benevolence. There were three things on benevolence we talked about. And John mentioned one just a minute ago. But can churches send funds to each other? They say they can't except for to bring about equality. And what they mean by that is mutual freedom from want. So if you have one church that's poor and one church that's rich, it's wrong, it's sinful for the poor church to send finances to the rich church. It can be the other way around. The rich church can send money to the poor church and kind of even the scales there, so to speak. But the poor church cannot send money to the rich church. Church treasuries extend only to the saints. And so the money that is in our church bank account, as a church, we can only use those funds to help other Christians. And it's sinful to use those funds to help non-Christians. So, if the church wanted to, in their perspective, have a, soup kitchen day or something like that, and we use church funds to pay for the supplies there, that's sinful since it's going to non-Christians. And then they'll also say that a church can't extend benevolence to any human organization. And so this is where the non-institution comes from here. There's a lot of human institutions. Businesses are institutions, schools are institutions. They'll say orphanages are institutions. And so church finances can only be spent on church matters. And those other organizations that may do good work should not receive money from the church because they can't satisfy the church's obligation to do those good works. So, if the church gives its money to an orphanage, orphanages do good works, they would agree with that. But the church has no business doing that because it doesn't satisfy the church's obligation to care for the orphans. Rather, the individuals should be giving to orphanages. And schools are good. Schools, education is one of the work of the church. But the church cannot send money to a Freed Hardman, for example, or a Southeast, for example, for education, because that's the work of the church. Rather, individuals can choose to support those institutions, but the church cannot. It's sinful to do so. And then on edification or building up, they say church money cannot be used for social affairs. And that can be a lot of different things. Things like potlucks and things like, if you had a youth group go to a movie night or something, then, the church may pay for a ticket for a kid or something like that. That's wrong. It's a social affair. So those are the three major and differing areas. And so what we're going to do is try and break these down just a little bit and address each of these issues. And we're probably not going to have time to go as in-depth as we possibly could. So I've got handouts to give at the end if you want one. And if you're watching online and you want one, I'll have extra, I'm sure, next week. So a look at evangelism. Can we send finances to congregations for the purpose of evangelism? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. The reasons why they say we can't are they see it as a violation of church autonomy, and they see it as going against a scriptural pattern. And I think both of these issues have problems. But you can understand why this would be a concern, right? The church should be autonomous. The church has the right and the obligation to rule over itself. You look at passages like 2 Peter 5 that talk about, elders oversee, or 1 Peter 5 rather, oversee the flocks that are among you. And churches have authority over individual congregations, and you shouldn't be giving up that authority. And so you can see a concern there. And of course, we want to be scriptural and do the things that the early church did. And so patterns are important. But I think they're mistaken in the way they go about this. So does giving finances violate a church's autonomy? They would say yes, because when I give, when the Dayton Church of Christ writes that check to Willette, I think, is the one that sponsors ADU, I think. When we write that check to Willette and they cash that check and then they give those funds, we lose some authority over our finances, right? Once that check goes to them, I don't know what they're going to do with it. And so they say it violates our autonomy. So how would you address that? What would you say?
I mean, it's the church that wrote the check, they decided to give that.
Yeah.
That's they weren't presumably coerced into doing that.
Yeah.
I don't see how you lose any autonomy because they made the decision. They could continue in the future, they could stop.
Yeah.
And if the sponsoring church doesn't do what they say they're going to do with it, that's on them. It's their problem. They've been deceitful. They've stolen funds from missionaries. And I don't think anybody would agree that's a good thing.
Yeah. So there's several things to consider. So first, the giving church has decided this is what they want to do with the funds. Second, if the sponsoring church, the church we write the check to that then goes and gives it to the missionary or whatever, if they abuse those funds, that's their abuse and their sin. Does surrendering funds mean you surrender autonomy? I don't think so, because if so, you got a lot of issues. Look over at 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians 11, look at verse 8. Paul says, I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. There's churches that are supporting Paul, and Paul says, I didn't want to, take their money, but I did in order that I can serve you. And when you support a missionary at all, does that not mean you lose some of your autonomy? There's a lot of churches that are writing Paul checks, so to speak, and there's whatever autonomy is lost in the writing of a check. Wouldn't it be lost in giving the check to an evangelist, right? Not to just harp on Adu, I guess, I wonder if he was going to watch this, we'll see. But we write the check to Adu, and we write it for him to do his ministry, and we say, use this as you see fit, right? If some of that check needs to go to pay your mortgage, well, pay your mortgage so that you can facilitate the work that needs to be done. But there is, whatever loss of autonomy would be in, giving the check to a sponsoring church is also present in giving it to a missionary. And so I think you have some challenge there. If a church loses autonomy in its evangelism, why not in its benevolence? We're going to talk more about benevolence in a little bit, but in Romans chapter 15, and in 2 Corinthians, one of the big things Paul does in his letters, some of his later letters, he talks about the collection of the saints in Jerusalem, and he mentions it in a lot of his epistles. And I think sometimes we don't realize how big of an event this was, but Paul has the church writing checks, and they transport it and give those checks to Jerusalem. And how do they know that Jerusalem's going to be using those checks in appropriate ways? And so you have some issues there.
Don't you think the elders, before they write a check to somebody, they look into it and talk to people? And they're not just writing out to anybody that.
Yeah. And so, and that's true. Elders have the obligation to ensure that they're not mismanaging the funds that are entrusted to them, right? They oversee. And so they have that obligation to make sure that they're being good stewards of what God's given. A sponsoring church doesn't assume the oversight of the work of the contributing churches, right? We write a check to Willette, and they send it to the missionaries, but does Willette tell us what to send and how to send it? And they're not dictating what we do. We choose to give to them so that they can, forward it on and collect it. And, it's an ease thing, right? It's much easier to receive your support from one church than have all these other sources of income. And so, but Willette does not tell us what to do. And so they're not taking authority away from us. Presumably, if we want to stop writing those checks, we can. And they can't tell us we can't. And so there is no real loss of autonomy here. You have, is this a violation of the scriptural pattern? So what a lot of non-institutional churches will say is that the pattern you see in Scripture is that churches send money directly to the evangelists. And so they say, when Paul receives his money, Paul receives it directly from these churches that are supporting him. And they cite passages like 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 8, which we just looked at. I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. Look at Philippians chapter 2. I don't know if I can turn there. In Philippians chapter 2, look at verse 25. That's chapter 3. It says, I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. And then they look at passages like chapter 4, verses 15. If you want to flip over there. And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me to help me, for my needs once again. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. I've received full payment and more. I'm well supplied, having received Epaphroditus, the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. And my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. And so they say, when you look at these passages, what you see is that there's this clear pattern of churches sending money directly, sending their support directly to Paul. You don't see examples of churches sending money to churches to then send to Paul. So what do you say to that?
They gave the money to, what's his name?
Epaphroditus.
Epaphroditus, and then he gave the money to Paul, so what's the difference?
Yeah. So they send wages to Epaphroditus, and then he sends. What you have here is some talk about what is done, but not a lot of talk about how it's done, right? The Macedonian churches send to Paul. Maybe there's some churches that contribute there. There's just not a lot said. And you just really can't make a strong claim that there's a pattern here of churches sending directly to. When you look at Philippians, Epaphroditus is a minister to the needs of Paul. Paul receives help from him, but it doesn't say whether it's direct or indirect. Disciples in Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas to help the saints in Judea, but it doesn't necessarily mean direct help. It's a stretch to make the claim that this is how it always has to be done. There's just not enough evidence, I don't think.
How do you know that other churches didn't send money to them to send it with Epaphroditus?
Yeah. Well, you don't, right?
Do we know for sure there weren't multiple congregations in some of these cities?
Yeah. And especially when you talk about, Galatia and the churches of Galatia. Galatia is, they are involved in benevolent work, and those are collections of churches, and the handout has a lot more detail, and I don't want to get too into the weeds on it, but I'll let you look at it here in a little bit. But it's too strong a case to say that there's a clear pattern from this passage. Let's move on a little bit to look at benevolence, or we're never going to get through all of this. So, is benevolence only permissible to bring about equality? They get this from 2 Corinthians chapter 8. But I think actually when you look at what the Bible teaches, you have the exact opposite thing being taught. So flip over, look at Romans first, and then 2 Corinthians. In Romans chapter 15, you have, these are both passages talking about the collection for the saints in Jerusalem. Romans 15:26, for Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. For they are pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them, for it, if the Gentiles, it goes on. So you have churches in Macedonia and Achaia that are making contributions to the saints in Jerusalem for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. I think that's important. You look at 2 Corinthians 8, look at verses 1 through 3. I want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord. And so here you have a very, very poor church, the Church of Macedonia. They're in severe poverty, extreme poverty. They're sending finances to the church in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is going through some challenges. That's kind of why there's a collection here to begin with. But who are they sending to, right? The poor among the saints. And so you have a distinction here between, it's not just for all the poor, right? There's poor among the saints in Jerusalem. It doesn't mean that all of the church of Jerusalem are poor. Jerusalem's a very wealthy place. And if you have poor in Jerusalem, extreme poverty in Macedonia, is it a stretch to say that perhaps you have a church that's poorer giving to a church that's richer? I think that's what you have going on here. And Paul says, listen, I almost had to tell him too much, right? You're in poverty and you're given, more than you should be given. But they're giving willingly. I'm not going to stop them from doing it. But even in their poverty, they're giving. They're overflowing in a wealth of generosity on their part. And so non-institutional churches will say it's sinful for a church to give to a church that is more wealthy than they are. But I don't think that's what Scripture teaches. Those sinful Macedonians. So how would you then justify? They pull from 2 Corinthians 8, look at verse 13, 14. They say, for I do not mean that others should be eased and, for I do not mean that others should be eased and you're burdened and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness or equality, your abundance at the present time should supply their need so that their abundance may supply your need. And there may be fairness. And so what they say is, this is their proof text for this, right? You have a poor church, a rich church. It sounds like he's saying, don't be given poor church to this rich church. Rich church ought to be given to you. There ought to be equality here. So how do you address that?
Well, not all churches can be equal.
Yeah.
In terms of, like a church of 15 versus a church of 2,000, you can't have equal money in the bank.
Yeah.
They might be, the small churches might be able to make a contribution to that big church in whatever work they're doing on something, if they're doing a disaster and cleanup or something. But that's their way to participate, and the little church couldn't do it by themselves.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that statement is like comparing church to church as much as it is individual situation to individual situation. There were poor among the Judean saints, and that's what the collection was being used for.
Yeah.
Not just generically, let's make everybody over there richer.
Yeah. So I think this is a total contextual misread of what's happening in this verse, is that argument. Because this is not, there's three churches involved in these verses. This is the context here are the Corinthians, Macedonians sending finances to Jerusalem. So he says, both of these churches talking about here are sending, not to each other. They're both sending to Jerusalem. He says, I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance in the present time should supply for their need so that their abundance may supply for your need and there may be fairness or equality. What's happening here is you got churches that are sending little, some churches that are capable of sending a lot. He says, no, if you can send a little, send a little. If you can send a lot, send a lot. and it balances each other out, right? I don't want the poor church to be overburdened. I don't want the wealthy church to be let off the hook. You both have a job to do, and so it equals out. And so I think it's just a misread of what's happening here in this passage to make that argument. So is benevolence for the saints only? And so the passage that often is referred to is 2 Corinthians 9. So flip over there. Look at verses 12 through 13 here. For the ministry of this service is not only supplying the needs of the saints, but is also overflowing in many thanksgiving to God. By their approval of this service, they will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ, and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others, while they long for you and pray for you because of the surpassing grace of God upon you. So what they say here is that in this passage, you have the giving of the collection is for the saints. And they say that what's being referred to here is the fact that this contribution goes to the saints and the saints only. Is that what's happening here? By their approval of this service, they will the service referring to the collection that's going on here. They will glorify God because of your submission that comes from your confession of the gospel of Christ and the generosity of your contribution for them and for all others. Who are the them and who are the all? That's the question. Non-institutionals will say that the them refers to the saints that are in Jerusalem specifically, and the all refers to all the other saints that are benefiting from this. Grammatically, you got some problems there. The them can't refer to the saints in Jerusalem exclusively because there's saints that are being benefited before the funds reach Jerusalem. I know all of this is kind of convoluted and we're hopping around and it might be a little confusing, but back up a little bit. Look at 2 Corinthians 8, verse 19 again. This is the context for what's going on here. He says, not only that, but he has been appointed by the churches to travel with us as we carry out this act of grace that is being ministered by us for the glory of the Lord himself will show us your goodwill. We take this course so that no one should blame us about this generous gift that's being administered by us. Skip down just a little bit and look at chapter 9, verse 12 again. For the ministry of the service is not only supplying the need of the saints, but is also overflowing in many thanksgiving by God. This is talking about Paul has been collecting finances to give to Jerusalem for some time now. And he's writing to the Corinthians about doing the same thing that's been happening in other churches. These finances haven't made their way to Jerusalem yet. And Paul's already saying that these finances, this collection, this ministry is blessing Christians. And so the them can't refer to exclusively Jerusalem Christians. The them simply refers to the saints. And so then you're left with this question of who are the all? The all would just be everyone else, non-Christians. And so this argument has some problems as well. It's very similar to what you see in Galatians chapter 6:10. This is our theme passage for the year. Galatians 6 is talking about, so as you have opportunity, do good to all, and especially the household of faith. It's very similar, right? Do good to everyone, but do good especially to those who are the household of faith. As Christians, we have a special obligation to see to the needs of the saints, to see to those who are of the household of faith, but we also have an obligation to do good to all. And so they say that you see a pattern in Scripture of benevolence being applied only to the saints, and I think you just don't. 2 Corinthians, you have finances that are going to the church at Jerusalem, and they're going to bless the saints that are there in Jerusalem, but they bless all else, all of the others that are there in Jerusalem. And so I think it's making too strong a case there. You also have talk about orphan homes. One of the major distinctions has been about support for orphan homes. And we support Potter's Children's Home, we support the Tennessee Children's Home, and all of these groups. And the argument we talked about last week is, well, churches shouldn't support orphan homes because it doesn't fulfill the Christian obligation to care for the orphans and that sort of thing. And so orphanages are institutions outside of the institutions that God ordained. And when you look at Scripture, God has ordained 3 institutions, right? God ordains the church, God establishes the home, God establishes government, and He gives authority to each one of these 3, right? Churches are places that God has given authority to elderships to oversee. Homes are institutions where God has given authority to, husbands to govern well. Governments are institutions that God has given the authority to bear the sword. And so the argument is God has not ordained orphan homes to be an institution. Therefore, the church should not support it. There's a lot of places you can go, but care of orphans requires a home, doesn't it? That's what orphans need. The church is not a home. Churches very often support homes. And so the church uses a lot of other institutions. The church uses, if you're building a new building, you're probably not doing that all by yourself. You'll pay a construction company to come and work and do all those sorts of things. And so the church is using this institution to facilitate work that needs to be done. Churches use grocery stores to buy food, to do benevolent work. And churches will buy services from radio stations or TV networks or newspapers to do good works and those sorts of things. And so, power company, right? Why do we draw the line at orphanages? And I think that's a pretty big problem. And so if we're buying services, so to speak, why can't we buy services to care for orphans in the home? And there's a lot more said, and I can get that to you on the handout, but we're going to just leave that there and move on a little bit. So edification, this is the other big, more visible one. So often when people know things about non-institutional churches, the things that they know, well, they don't support orphans and they don't eat in church. And, that's kind of the characterization is not always kind in the way it's presented. But non-institutional churches have very different things about edification. So we talked yesterday or last week about how they accuse institutional churches as participating in the social gospel. And what they mean by that is in providing fun opportunities or outside of religious fellowship opportunities. What you're doing is essentially making people similar to the disciples of Jesus or followers of Jesus in John chapter 6, that we're just coming to get their bellies full. And so they accuse that as being, just creating these shallow faith people that aren't here for the right reasons. And no one is defending no one's defending the people that were coming just to get their bellies full. And I don't think there's any church that's really trying to just fill the bellies and not, attract people for that reason and no spiritual purpose behind it. So I think that's a false accusation on a lot of fronts. But pursuing edification is biblical. In Romans chapter 14, verse 19, you have the command to edify and to build up others. And you have all throughout the Bible, lots and lots of talk about how Christians need to be in the business of edification. And, sharing meals, for instance, this is the big one. Non-institutional churches don't have a kitchen in their building. Sharing a meal builds community. Sharing a meal is a perfect time for edification. And it's one that we shouldn't dismiss. Churches have an obligation to edify. The obligation is there. How you go about that, I think there's some liberty. And so if sharing a meal builds the church up together, then the church should be involved in that. In Jude chapter 12, you have a discussion about love feasts, which is kind of, we don't talk about that too much, but what you have here is it's a fellowship opportunity that the church is involved in. One of the things the church does is they eat together and they share meals together. And it was an important part of the early church in the first several centuries. The church eats together. And I don't think that we should be dismissing opportunities to build community, especially in a culture and day and age where those are so hard to come by. But also, the claim is that fellowship only can be used to apply to talk about spiritual activities. But that's just simply not right. The term fellowship can be used to refer to any activity where there's joint participation. And it's used that way a lot in the Bible. A good example is Luke chapter 5, in verse 10. You have talk about Peter and John. And Peter is a companion of John in their fishing trade, right? When Jesus calls Andrew and Peter brothers, they're working alongside of James and John. They're fishing companions, they're partners. The word there is they're in fellowship with each other. That's what the Greek word there is. And so to say that fellowship can only apply to spiritual activities is fishing a spiritual activity. It's their livelihood. It's just their everyday life together. And so you can't make that argument. It doesn't hold water. And they also will argue that, a lot of these edification activities end up being abused and misused. There's a lot of churches that have spent so much money on their buildings and their facilities that they neglect the work of God, right? They may have a, multi-million-dollar building and just phenomenal facilities, but they're not doing a lot of the work that they need to be doing. And so because abuses happen, that doesn't mean that the principle, the liberty that they have to do some of those things is null and void. Certainly, churches need to be good stewards of what's been given to them. And elderships are entrusted with finances, and they're entrusted in spending those finances. And if they make poor decisions, they're going to give an account for the decisions that they make. And so no one's advocating for poor handling of God's resources that are given to the church. But to say that because abuses happen, that we should not use any church resources towards edification and fellowship, I think goes too far. So we talked about a lot, and I know we went really fast and probably didn't cover everything that we probably could have covered, and there's a lot more to this topic. And quite frankly, I'm not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination. And a lot of my notes are coming straight from my dad's notes, which he's used a lot in the past. And the non-institutional controversy, I think, is a shame. It's a shame that there's a rift in the church. I hope that there's unification in the future. This rift's really existed for about 60 years or so. But unity is really hard, and unity doesn't happen naturally. If we want to be unified, we got to put in the effort, and we got to work towards it and pursue it. And so God wanted his church to be unified. I think we should too. And there's a lot of work to be done on that front. So if you got more questions, we can talk about it more. And if you're watching online, I know we have a slim crowd today, a lot of people out sick and maybe watching later. If you need those handouts, I'll have those. Thank you for listening.